Welcome to Chapter 8 of Same Lake, Different Boat, coming alongside people touched by disability. The title of Chapter 8 is on living a new normal life. In this chapter, Steph will explore the essential question, how does a family find their stride?
Families of special needs kids in general need a sense of normalcy. They need a sense of, we as people who do not have special needs kids tend to approach those children as very fragile and very, that we think that they need to be isolated, not just in a group of children, but they need to be monitored and they need to be, we're going to put them over here where we can keep a close eye on them. And that's very harmful to the child in a lot of ways, but it's devastating to the parents because that's their child and they love that child for who they are. And these families need to know that we care about their children for who they are. And not just the kids, but we care about the families. And we care about the struggles that the things that some of these families go through to just get their child to all the hospital visits and keep their child well and is incredible. And we need to show them that we appreciate that in them and that we care about that in them and that we're there to help if we can.
Some of the issues I think that happen within a family when a child is born with disabilities for us, and I can only speak for us right now, is we have a daughter that is 3.5 years older than our son with disabilities. And I felt like I've missed half of her childhood because of my attentions needed to be elsewhere with 11 specialists. And you want to be able to know your child. I mean, they're all a gift from God. And so I never, ever wanted to say I miss Sarah's childhood because of Doug. And that was never true. But I was torn by having my attentions on him rather than on Sarah. But our congregation came alongside us and would watch Sarah. They would write down exactly what she did that day and kind of a diary of her activities. And so I still felt a part of her life. But that is one of the stressors, I think, of feeling like you can give equal time to your children. The romance between you and your husband, that was very difficult. But we had some wonderful friends that we switched bed and breakfast times with in the spring. And they would watch our children for 4 days, and then the next week we would watch their children for 4 days. And that was a breath of fresh air, that held us together. For that 4 days we could go away. We knew our children were being cared for and loved. And it was good to know that we could reciprocate in that way too. So you felt that was, you were helping out somebody else as well.
And actually that makes me think of our meeting with Johnny Erickson Tata, because we got to meet one-on-one with her, and that was like, even if Mama never had the wreck, I was like, in awe of her, because as a kid I read her book and we talked about that. And she said, in their life it's an unfortunate reality too, that you do learn quickly that, I hate to say people don't care, but as far as the professions that you have to deal with, whether it be doctors, hospitals, medical suppliers, wheelchair companies, ventilator companies, wound care, all these different people that you end up realizing you have to work with can be quite clinical and not very quick to serve you, quick to do what you would think that they are put there to do. And so it can be very frustrating, and it's definitely not a time to be quiet or humble, or you really have to get in there to defend the person and to get the things that you need. There's been times I've had to call, 5 or 6 times in a row to get my mom's ventilator supplies. Well, that's not the time to be nice and gentle. If she doesn't have these things, she's not breathing. I have to tell these people, if this was your mother, you would care. I need these supplies. I need them now. And so things like that. And it is frustrating because I don't want to project that image to people in case it's somebody that doesn't know the Lord. But Johnny gave me this verse. She said, Proverbs 31:8-9, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all those who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Yeah, that's been an interesting thing. Dad calls that the bulldog role. Johnny calls it being an advocate. So.
how does a family find their stride? We talked earlier about the whole idea of coming to terms with the new reality and what that involves for a family at the onset of disability. Then we looked into the whole question of acceptance. What does negotiating a pathway to acceptance look like? And what we want to explore tonight is this idea of how does a family find their stride? What does a new normal look like for a family, and how do they get there? And of course, the second question that we always have tagged onto these two to make it relevant is the idea of is what's the role of the church as well. So how does a family find their stride, or in economic terms, how do they find their new equilibrium? And what's the role of the church in that? One of my favorite books on family life, which I think I mentioned to you in another segment, was the book by Helen Featherstone called A Difference in the Family. And one of the things I really like about that particular book is this quote where she says, differences differ only in degree from those of other families. Sometimes it's easy to look at the subject of disability as if it's a totally other type of experience and something we really can't identify with. And yet, especially in this new normal concept, this new normal phase of family life, I think when you can understand that the differences that families face are differences of degree to the same type of challenges that all of us face. And then you can say, well, what are the challenges that I face in my life? And then you can extrapolate those to an extended level of difficulty. And for some families, that might be in one or two areas of life, but for other families, it might be entirely across the board, in 10 or 12 different areas of life where there's an extended level of difficulty. And so, of course, the accumulated effects of that extended level of difficulty across all of these areas, results in a higher level of stress and, as was mentioned in some of the video clips, also a level of exhaustion as well. So differences differ only in degree from those of other families. One of the questions I think a family really has to come to terms with in this phase of their family life is this idea of when is it appropriate to call in crisis intervention, and when does the family just need natural supports? When do they need supports? When do they need crisis intervention? And that's not always a clear-cut answer as far as either how the family sees their situation or how people outside of it see their situation as well. So I think one of the things that kind of story-wise has illuminated this idea to me was our son Tim was really into Star Wars when he was about 8 years old, and so we had an entire collection of lightsabers around the house. And during this period of time that he was really into Star Wars, he was also into calling the 911 operator. So you know how at elementary school they'll teach the kids, so what you do in an emergency is you pick up the phone, you dial 911. And so Tim was really into practicing his homework. So we went through this phase where he had called the 911 operator 3 times in the same week. And poor Freddie was mortified because how if you call the 911 operator and it's a child, they'll call back to confirm, that that's an authentic call. So Freddie was the one that picked up the phone every time. So by the 3rd one, he's like, Mom, we have to make it stop. So we'd gone away for the weekend to a friend's house up in State College, and sure enough, they had lightsabers. Well, so Tim was running around the house swashbuckling the lightsaber, and I was out having coffee with this friend of mine, and he came out to the kitchen, and he was really disgruntled because the light bulb was not working inside the lightsaber, but we didn't have any batteries and there was no way to fix it. And I said, Tim, you can still have a great time with that. It doesn't matter if the light works or not. So I sent him off to play in the other room, and so he went on his way for a little bit, and all of a sudden I heard him calling me persistently, from the other room, and he's going, Mom, it's the phone, it's for you. And I'm thinking, how could it be for me? I mean, this isn't my house, So I went in there, and he was in one of the kids' bedrooms, and they had one of these Mickey Mouse phones, and so he just, kind of thrust the receiver at me. And so I'm just looking at him, and I picked up the phone, and it was the 911 operator. And she said, we understand that the young man's told us that someone is choking on a lifesaver. And I'm going, no. I'm looking at Tim the whole time, across the receiver, like, no one here is choking on a lifesaver. She goes, we've dispatched an ambulance. And I said, no, I'm start begging, please don't send the ambulance. So the whole time I'm glaring at Tim over the receiver, and I finally got the 911 operator to agree that we were not having an emergency and to call back the ambulance. And so when I hung up the phone, I looked at Tim. I said, what were you thinking? And he holds up the lightsaber, and he says, I have a broken lightsaber. So she thought he had said a choking on a lifesaver. So he had called the 911 operator to see if she could fix the lightsaber since I couldn't do it. So, but that scenario is actually similar sometimes to what happens with families. They're at this stage of coming to terms with actually what does normalcy look like for them, and sometimes it's difficult for them to discern when is something an emergency and when is something actually part of my new normal life. And the same thing again happens too with people around them. I've had times at church where somebody will come up to me all in a dither over, we have to rescue, somebody, and sometimes we have to sit down and go, okay, let's talk about it. Is this really an emergency, or is this a new normal situation where we can provide some kind of assistance in a different way? So anyway, what are these differences of degree that families face? I want to run through a series of these. We'll do it pretty quickly. The first one's personal care, then education, behavior, time management, social isolation, access and advocacy, and family relationships. There were some that we introduced in the opening chapter on coming to terms with the new reality, and those included things like medical issues and financial issues. Those will also be ongoing, but I'm not going to readdress those this time. The first one's personal care. If you think about it, again, remember the whole framework here is differences of degree. Any parents expect to do some level of feeding and diapering for children as they're growing up, but you usually expect that kids will become independent in those things by age 2 or 3. And what happens in a family affected by disability with certain types of disabilities, those tasks can go on for a lifetime, or even for an extended period of time. So a child with an intellectual disability, it may take them 6-8 years to become toilet trained instead of 2. Somebody with a profound disability, you may be dealing with personal care issues for an entire lifetime. Somebody with a spinal cord injury, there'll always be personal care issues related to that as well. And so one of the things too, as well, as far as the whole issue of inclusion in life activities as well for children, a lot of times one of the requirements to be involved in a lot of activities in early childhood is that the children are potty trained. So, you can see right away there becomes, it's a very practical barrier there to kids being involved in even typical social activities because of some of these things related to personal care. The second one's education. All of us want to have a great educational experience for our children, and we're willing to work hard to see that happens. And for kids with special needs and their parents, their families have the same type of values, but the level of complexity that's involved in that is, again, a difference of degree. Schooling, first of all, begins much earlier. When Tim started school at 2 months old, and that's how early the early intervention program starts. So instead of starting at 4 in preschool or 5 in kindergarten, you're talking about 60 days, right? And so you can see even then too, as a family is going through that whole entry level stage, and then they're starting out with that even early intervention program that early, but that extends all the way through. And even while special education laws certainly provide for access to many things, often different school districts have different ways of interpreting those policies and the level of advocacy required on the part of parents in order to actually acquire the things that their children need and that their children actually have legal rights to. It can be just really very, very complicated. Another thing, too, is the whole triangle between public school, Christian school, homeschool, right? Is that different Christians will have very strong opinions sometimes about those different levels of schooling, and yet kids with disabilities often don't have access, for example, to Christian schooling. So if you run in circles where Christian schooling has a high value, and with that value tends to come judgment of people who don't go to Christian school, that puts families who have children with disabilities in a real quagmire that way. And so the other thing is, too, that even if a child may be going to public school, there are times that even with the legally provided services, they may not really be acquiring what they really, really need in order to succeed. And so then sometimes families choose to homeschool, whether they philosophically are not big advocates for homeschooling. They sometimes find that is the only option they can pursue in order to really meet the needs of their child. And that requires a whole accommodating of family life in order to make that succeed. As families who choose to homeschool by principal would tell you as well. So, anyway, so it takes a lot of grace to really respect that there are different ways of educating kids, Christian kids, for different reasons, and so that whole issue of education is something that can come up, and it doesn't just come up for a short period of time. It lasts all the way through a child's educational experience, which typically for kids with intellectual disabilities goes to into their 20s and not just to 18 years old. Next one is behavior. All of us as parents desire to see our children learn self-control, right? And yet for some types of disabilities, self-control is a really challenging issue, and behavior can be a really challenging issue. And again, with the self-control and the behavior often comes this issue of judgment at times that comes from other people who may be observing behavior from the outside but don't really understand what the underlying source is. And sometimes I'll have people ask me, does that mean that kids with disabilities get a pass, right? I was like, well, of course not. You know, kids with disabilities need to learn self-control and need to learn appropriate behavior just like anybody else. It just takes a lot more diligence and a lot more creativity sometimes to help kids with certain types of disabilities learn that. The other thing, too, is that sometimes behaviors can actually be a function of an inability to communicate. So a child that has really limited communication, imagine if you couldn't communicate most of the things that you were thinking or feeling or wanted someone else to know, that the level of frustration can get extremely high. And so sometimes when we'll see what we call behavior, it can really be the only way a person with a particular type of disability knows how to even begin to communicate what they're thinking or they're feeling. So again, another area where we need a lot of grace. Kids with disabilities don't get a get out of jail free card. They need the same things that other kids need, but they often need them delivered with a lot more grace and patience. And we all know just from what it's like raising quote unquote typical kids, that takes a lot of grace and patience. So there's a lot of, again, a lot of creativity, energy, and persistence required on the part of parents at times. Another difference of degree. Time management. Time management, again, is something that everybody struggles with. I think there are very many people you'd run into in the 21st century who would say that they don't struggle with time management and not having enough margin in their lives. For families affected by disability, there are just additional things that get added to the to-do list. And doctor's appointments, what we used to call the parade of therapists. And when we lived in State College, we had home-based therapy, whereas when we had lived earlier in Lancaster County, we had center-based therapy. And Tim got a lot more therapy when we went to the home-based system, but we were also home a lot because we had a therapist every day pretty much coming through the house, and then Tim went out to a preschool program 2 mornings a week, and then he napped every afternoon. So that doesn't leave you a whole lot of margin to actually do anything. So again, part of this whole phase in family life isn't to sit around and wring your hands saying, woe's me, we can't get anything done. You just find other ways to do it. So and so we used to import a lot. I think people, when we lived in State College, thought we were incredibly hospitable, but I think I probably had some additional motives as well, because it was the only way we could really spend time with other people was to make sure we had folks in for lunch on a regular basis. So, but time management, again, another one of those differences in degree. Social isolation. I mean, every family makes choices about what level of social engagement they want. And some families really prefer a more remote type of lifestyle, and some families really like a really engaged lifestyle. And the difference with a family affected by disability is really sometimes a loss of choice in that matter. They may, and I think the families it's most challenging for are the ones who would naturally have a very outgoing type of social personality, and yet the limitations of the family member with a disability might make it really difficult for them to find that level of engagement. If you think about just some of the really practical things, like suppose you have a child with spina bifida and you're in the middle of making a recipe right at dinner time and you realize you forgot one ingredient, right? I mean, it's hard enough if you take your typical kids and throw them in the car seat and run to the store, right? But if you have to get the wheelchair outside, get the lift down, right? I mean, everything just becomes more complicated. And so again, it's just a difference of degree of the complexity. Or if you have a child with autism and you have to make a run to Walmart, and just think about the way Walmart is, right? And so a lot of bright lights, a lot of noise, a lot of visual distractions. And so for somebody who is very susceptible to sensory overload, places like that can really be difficult kind of places to go. And so because of that, families may just find themselves, kind of hunkering down at home because it's just more complicated than it's worth to run out and do those kind of things. When Tim was little, his signature issue was whenever there was loud noise or any new and exciting thing, he would toss his cookies. So we just kind of got used to traveling with extra clothes because anytime you went somewhere where it was just a little bit over the top, exciting and fun, that meant you could guarantee that lunch would return. So there's one particular time I remember I took him to the mall and we were going shoe shopping. And shoe shopping alone was kind of a challenging thing because he was kind of a random kind of guy at that age. He was probably about 4 or 5. And so actually getting into the mall, going to one place and getting back out, was no small task anyway. So I had said, well, if we're able to get through this shoe shopping trip, well, let's hop on the merry-go-round on the way out, and that'll be kind of fun. So we got through the shoes, and we're standing in line at the merry-go-round, and he was standing there and said, "Oh, my belly hurts." And so trying to be sympathetic, I just leaned down and put my head next to his tummy. Yep. Anyway, he threw up on the back of my head in the mall. So anyway, that was a kind of humbling experience, but it was we actually had a few good laughs about that. Learning to laugh about things when they happen helps a lot too. If you can have a good sense of humor, it takes you a long way. So anyway, social isolation is again one of those potential issues. Access and advocacy. All of us would like our kids to have access to opportunities in life, and we're willing to do the things that we need to do to try to open doors for them. And for children who have disabilities, it's just another difference of degree. Simple things like being able to acquire a ride to school, right? You would just assume that your kids are going to get picked up by the bus at the doorstep. That's not always such a simple thing in the public school system with a child with special needs, whether they're going to ride the regular bus or whether they're going to get picked. There's a complexity that comes with that. Trying to see that your child with special needs is included in the local neighborhood school if you're going to public school is a challenge. If you go through private school, it has its own challenges as well, because sometimes private schools really aren't very well geared to deal with the exceptionalities of kids on either end, of the spectrum. Getting your child into community activities always takes somebody that's going to help bridge making that happen, as some of the accommodations that need to happen for that to take place, and just trying to create a social world for your child. Tim was has gone all through public school here in Lancaster County where we are, and he really has had a great experience. But we had a few little bumps in the road from time to time, and one was when Tim was either in about first grade or kindergarten. There were a bunch of kids in our neighborhood, a bunch of little boys that were all in the same class, and so they all rode the same bus, and so they got off the bus one day, and it was this one fellow's birthday, and so they're all running down the road, all excited about this birthday party, and Tim's running down the road as fast as he could, trying to keep up with them, but the only problem was that Tim was the only one that wasn't invited to the birthday party. And so, as he's trying to run down the road, I just scooped him up. He was small enough then that I could do that. I just scooped him up and carried him down to the house, and just kind of tried to distract him into other things. And he just kind of went with the flow of it. It wasn't a big deal to him, but it was a big deal to me. It was really, really hard to understand why one more child couldn't have gone to the party. And so the social isolation that happens, and it's not that that's a unique experience that other kids don't go through as well, but the frequency with which that happens to kids with disabilities is definitely higher. So one of the big things I'd encourage you as far as families and advocacy is, they have to work to get their kids into Cub Scouts and school and soccer and whatever other kind of activities they're involved in. And I just really encourage you, don't make them work to get into church, right? Make it as easy as possible for them to be welcomed into the body of Christ and for that access to be as effortless as possible. And then the last one is just the whole subject of family relationships. When Tim was born, a minister of pastoral care at our church came to visit us at the hospital. And at this time, actually, Tim was probably about 12 weeks old. And he had bacterial spinal meningitis. And he came in and he was talking to us about he knew we'd been through, this is our third hospitalization at that point in the first 12 weeks. And so he was talking to me about the whole idea of the pie of life. You know, how a family has one pie and it can be sliced in, different combinations. And and I thought he had some really good counsel, because what he was saying was that by definition, a child with special needs will require a bigger slice of the pie. But the key is to not let that slice of the pie become so disproportionately large that it starts to outweigh all other aspects of family life. And so trying to make choices that help to keep that in balance. Since then I've thought about too the whole idea of wheel weights on a tire. Sometimes those weights around the tire will get out of balance. You'll either lose some or whatever, and the wheel starts to go wop 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 wop. Right? And so I think that same thing happens in family life. It happens to everybody's family life from time to time. I just think that there are more opportunities for it to happen when there's a child with special needs in the family. And so kids have a way of letting you know when life is getting out of balance. And we found by listening to both of our kids, they had ways of letting us know it was time to reevaluate and see if we could put things back into balance again. One of the things I think that's a potential issue in this area is just the whole idea of never allowing one person to become the center of the family system. A person by definition may need a bigger piece of the family pie, but if and all of us have probably met families like this for one reason or another, had some person was the center of the family system and not God himself, right? So when you think about it, that's really a form of idolatry. And anytime that anybody becomes the center of a family, instead of God being the center of the family and everybody else is on the rim of the wheel, so to speak. And so I think that's again one of those real challenges to find balance. One of the key points I'd really like you to think about, and we could do a whole half hour on this, but we won't, is the whole issue of siblings. And often the siblings in a family, the siblings of a child with special needs, or the children who may have a parent who has significant disabilities, can really get lost in the shuffle. They sometimes, just by necessity, will end up carrying heavier weights than children of that age typically would. And at the same time, you have to be really careful with boundaries. A sibling is not another parent, right? And so one of the most touching kind of areas where I get feedback in my job is people I talk to who grew up with a brother or sister with a disability and in their 20s or their 30s are really processing that still. Sometimes processing their identity because they're almost as if their whole family identity was forged around the disability itself. And so then they find themselves trying to answer the question, who am I, right? Who am I outside of the definition of disability itself in my family? And so anyway, I just really encourage you to keep the siblings on the radar screen in your church. Most parents I've talked to really appreciate when people take the initiative to look up the siblings in the family and make intentional efforts to take them out to do other things that have nothing to do, right, with their sibling who has disabilities and nothing to do with disability, that are just fun kid kind of things that give them an opportunity to do things that maybe their family just can't do because it's really not possible for them as a family to engage in that type of activity. So family relationships, the siblings, the kids, marriages. The divorce rate for families affected by disability is very high. It's somewhere in the 80% range. And I was talking to someone at Johnny and Friends a couple months ago, and he was saying I'm really tired of quoting the divorce statistic, as something that we're just sort of stuck with. Instead, why don't we do something about it? And I think providing appropriate family supports and recognizing these areas of difference of degree and finding just practical ways to bring assistance into family life really can help in that area, making sure that husband and wife are able to get a date night. And anybody who has kids knows that you need that. But if you are doing doctors and therapies, all these things all the time and are never getting time to just actually build your relationship as a couple, that the family in the end is going to be harmed because of it. And so keeping those family relationships in balance. And one last note on the marriage issue is it doesn't have to make a marriage weaker. I mean, I've seen a lot of scenarios where disability in the life of a family has made a marriage stronger. And so I'd encourage you to also keep that perspective in mind as well. Stress and exhaustion, right? Those are two. It's not hard to see how those would be things that result because of all these different realities in family life. So how can you help when a family is dealing with the stress level and the exhaustion? Basically, these 5 quick things. The first one is engagement. And that's kind of goes back to that phrase we used a couple weeks ago, be where they are, right? I mean, families affected by disability may not necessarily show up at your doorstep at church. And there can be a lot of reasons for that. One might be that those families never went to church before they had their child with disabilities, so it wouldn't be normal for them to go to church at this phase in their life. But if you want to have an outreach to families affected by disability, you'll need to be where they are in order to reach them. Sometimes families are really struggling with the issues of acceptance, and they have issues with God, over what they're dealing with in their lives, and that's why they don't go to church. Other times it's the advocacy issue. They don't have the energy to advocate on Sunday morning. They've been doing that Monday through Saturday in 6 other venues, right? And so that's another reason that you'll have to meet families with disabilities on their turf and not necessarily on yours. The second one is the idea of good boundaries. The whole idea of good fences make good neighbors, essentially. If you look at Galatians 6, verses 2-5, and I'm going to borrow some ideas here off of Townsend and Cloud's book, Boundaries, which I think is really helpful in this area. Galatians 6, 2-5 says, "Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he's nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. For each one will have to bear his own load." And the 2 words in there, the first one's burdens, right? And the word burden, and those are 2 different words in the original Greek. The word burdens actually is the idea of a boulder. And so it's something that would actually crush you if you attempted to carry it yourself. So when it says carry one another's burdens, it really means we have to get underneath of that boulder together and lift as a team in order to relieve the family of the weight of that boulder. The idea of each one bearing his own load, that word is more akin to a backpack, something, and it might be a heavy backpack, but it's still a load that's meant to be carried alone. Okay, and so that doesn't mean that carrying that load won't require a lot of encouragement or a lot of assistance, but it is still the responsibility of the one who carries it. So the whole idea of having good boundaries and discerning, when do you step in? When is it a boulder? When is it a backpack? They're not fixed and hard rules. It really takes wisdom and discernment and to really be able to tell the difference and to know when do we come alongside and assist, when do we encourage. Practical ways of assisting are anything from providing. Of course, it's going to depend on the individual family and what their circumstances are, but can be just practical things, anything from providing meals to making a date night possible, which could be in different forms of a respite care program or just babysitting that takes place between natural friendships, care of siblings, meals, cleaning, transportation, going to doctor's visits with someone. It's not hard to think of just practical things. And every one of those little practical things of assistance is a way of coming alongside somebody who's carrying a heavy backpack and being able to make that pathway something that's more doable for them as a family. Encouragement. That's another thing. Even if you're carrying your own backpack, you might need encouragement when you're going up hills, essentially. And so I can't tell you how helpful it was when Tim was younger and we were trying to get him to sit through a Sunday morning service, and Tim really liked to sit in the front row. So it was always a pretty interesting exercise in, oh boy, all sorts of things. But we got everybody at church kind of hung in there together with us while we were a period of years that it took for Tim to learn how to sit through a worship service, and with a lot of grace and patience, and we got so many affirming and encouraging comments along the way. When people would notice that Tim was making it, 10 minutes longer, and he wasn't snoring anymore, or whatever was no longer licking the bottom of his shoe, whatever the issue was that was usually going on. And yes, that is true. He did used to do that. So, but really, those little words of encouragement just take parents a long way. Affirmation goes so much farther than I think one of the most underutilized gifts in the church is the gift of encouragement. Because it just gives people energy to just go that next round. And then perspective. The last one is perspective. And we all need perspective. All of us lose our perspective from time to time. And families affected by disability aren't any different that way, other than the things about which they might lose their perspective might be a little bit different than the things about which you and I might lose our perspective. One of the things that you hear a lot in disability world circles is the phrase, a life like any other. And there's some good things about that phrase, and there's some not so good things about that phrase. Because, the good things about that phrase, what I think is intended by that phrase is the idea that providing access to the same things that anyone else would have access to. That becomes a helpful use of that phrase. When the expectation is that the outcome of every person's life will be a life like any other, that ceases to be a particularly helpful thing, because no two outcomes are the same, right? What is a life like any other exactly? My life isn't like your life, and your life isn't like your life, right? None of us have a life exactly like any other. And so I think when it becomes the perspective giving issue sometimes surrounds this idea of how will I live the life I have been given, right? Not how do I acquire a life like that person, right? And so that's really at the heart of the issue, and that's at the heart of the issue for all of us, right? For different reasons, but often for families, I think, who are trying to find their stride, to hit their new normal, trying to understand that a life like any other means having access to the opportunities others would have access to, and yet trusting that the outcomes that God gives us are going to be different, because the life that He's given us is a life He's uniquely given to us for His glory and for our good. So in summary, families who are looking to live a new normal life, they'll be looking to just simply take the same kind of challenges that you and I face in life, and yet they experience them in differences of degree. They'll be looking to see, how can I live the life that God's given me, and do it in a way that honors Him, and that will require, at times, your assistance and your encouragement, just like your life and my life requires the assistance and encouragement of others as well.
Remember, it's all different and it's all the same. Families touched by disability face the same types of struggles as other families, but to a greater degree. May all families within the church be willing, in biblically boundaried ways, to engage each other by providing assistance, encouragement, and perspective. Please take a few moments to listen to the following interviews and consider the questions posed at the end of each segment.
Well, the hospitality ministry, if you want to call it that, has an interesting beginning, because I changed. Its root is in the change of my jobs last May. I moved from one company to another, and my previous company I had been very occupied, very busy, very stressed out, and I didn't have much extra time. But with my change to my new job, all of a sudden I had a life, and so I was looking for things productive to do with this extra time, and so one of my heart desires was to do something for the Wheelers. So I approached them and I said, okay, here's my story. what could I do for you? You know, name it. I'm a handyman. I can do all kinds of things. What would you like me to do for you? And so they thought about it, and they came back shortly thereafter and said, why don't you cook for us? And why don't we do it on a Thursday night? And why don't we do it every other Thursday night? And why don't we invite people in? And it just kind of, there it was. And so last September we started doing that very thing. And so I normally, cook the night before most of the time, so that it's just a matter of carrying it in when I get to their house on Thursday evening, because of course I work on Thursday, and carrying it in and doing last minute preparations, and then it becomes a time of fellowship and hospitality, and they invite all kinds of folks in. Like, for example, last week was their daughter's and granddaughter's birthday. They have the same birthday, and so we celebrated their birthday on Thursday night. They're such warm people. That's just a part of their nature. Lynn is just one of those people she's always been that way, and her disability has not changed that. So when folks come into their home, it's just, for us, Denise and I, when we go each week, I'm busy over there stirring pots and cooking and so forth, but eventually you get past that point and you get to sit down and enjoy a meal, and it's just such a warm place to be. And as with most things like that, it's more of a ministry to us than what we do as a ministry to them. We come away blessed from each Thursday night.
How does Marty's ministry of cooking facilitate the Wheelers in expressing their God-given gifts of hospitality?
We've had some really sweet times when we've gone over and just sat around Lynn's bed or the wheelchair and just talked about days before, family, their family, our family. And, so many times I just completely forget that Lynn's paralyzed. I don't even think about that. We just sit and talk like you and I would sit and talk. What I do and to go back to what I was going to say, one other thing I wanted to say before you asked that question is what I do for the it's not really so much what I do for the Wheelers at all. It's really what God does to provide for their needs using someone very ordinary like me. I consider it a really high calling to serve them. I'm humbled and I'm so blessed by it. The Wheelers they're really great friends. They're fun people. They're Braves fans. What can I say? We've been with Lynn and Doug every year to a Braves game since the accident. We usually make it one big outing and spend the day, and the Braves have been awesome about accommodating us and getting us where we need to be, and we have a grand time. It's always a great day. And the first time we did it was just months after her accident. And to be honest, I think we all were scared to do it, because it was Lynn's first, I guess, really big outing. And, but, God opened every door. And when it was all over, it brings tears to my eyes that we actually did that. And I think it just made us more comfortable that we can do just anything. Nothing's changed, really. We can do anything as long as we have God fronting us. We can go through any door.
What does it mean to not even notice the disability anymore? How does this reflect it's all different and it's all the same?
And then when we got to Jackson, and Marty kept pushing me to bring my son, who's 14 now, and he makes noise and he will move around and isn't always appropriate, and I wouldn't bring him for a long time. And the day that she forced me to bring him, and she even sat in church with him for a little while, I realized that as a parent, it can be hard to allow people to carry that with you. And it was really hard, not because I didn't want help, but because it had been my burden to carry, and I didn't want to burden other people. And so I realized how hard it was for me to take my hands off and let other people help me so that I could experience church, and he could too, because I realized I was holding him back as well. It was a trust issue because I knew I had to trust someone else with him. I had to trust the church that it would be okay if he made noise, that they could handle his disability because he makes noise and he's not always appropriate. So I realized I needed to trust the church to respond well to my son. I discovered that I had a very angry teenage daughter because she had watched her whole life. She had watched the church not embrace her brother as he was. And I had played into that because I didn't always let the church carry that with me. And so I realized that I needed to do that different, and I needed to trust people to carry. I need to trust the church to carry that burden with us. And so I let her, and for him as well. It was good for him to experience church outside of the confines that I was setting up for him.
Why do families sometimes struggle to accept assistance from others?